Okay. Well, I guess the recording has started. Yeah. All right. I am recording this. We looked at the design argument. We looked at Paley. Now, Hume has one of the, as far as the history of philosophy goes, Hume has, one of the historically most famous criticisms, critiques of the design argument. In fact, Hume thought so much of what he had done on the design argument that I think I mentioned last time. One of the three things he wanted to be remembered for in his life, we're not going to worry about the other two, but one of the three things among all of the things he had done and written, one of which was a 10-volume set that was the standard history of England for years after. Among all the things was his, what he thought the destruction of the design argument. Now, not everyone, and certainly not Paley, was willing to admit that Hume destroyed the design argument. And there are many people today who still accept parts or all of the design argument. But we want to look at some of the critiques of it. There it is. And pass this around. And say a little bit about evolutionary theory in passing, because your author mentioned some things about that in the pages that are listed in the syllabus. I can go pass this around. Is there anyone who's not taken the objective part of the test? Okay, that's good. So this is something we saw when we went over writing a philosophy paper. If people could maybe pull down the shades, it might be a little help. Those of you who are next to them, I think that's doing a little bit. At any rate, one of the things that we saw when we went over how to write a philosophy paper was the fact that frequently you want to assume that the imaginary person to whom you're writing your paper or your essay is both competent and ignorant. That is, that they're competent enough to understand your arguments and what you have to say, but they may need to be brought up to speed on the topic. And this is essentially what Hume does here. You have three characters in this argument. Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion was something he wrote at the very end of his life. And he knew it was going to be a very controversial book. Now, at the beginning of his life, when he wanted to make a splash in the subject, get himself on the map, he was hoping for the best, for a lot of criticism and feedback on his first book, The Treatise of Human Nature, and he wrote to a friend that the book fell stillborn from the presses. Nobody paid any attention to it because nobody knew who he was. But by this time, Hume has an international literary reputation, not only in philosophy, but he also wrote the Standard History of England. And so, at this point, at the end of his life, he doesn't want to be bothered by criticism, right? So he's got a book that he knows is going to be very controversial because it focuses on things like the design argument, natural theology, what he calls natural religion. You know, the part of philosophy that asks whether we can prove anything about God just from observations of the world or from abstract arguments like the ontological argument. You know, that Paley's book is called Natural Theology, and Hume calls his book Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And there are three characters in it. There is the skeptical philosopher Philo, which basically is who? I mean, who? That's David Hume himself, right? There is somebody who we'll see later who is pretty much a, you know, a simple, straightforward, maybe fundamentalist believer. And then there's the person who, in the dialogue, summarizes the design argument, right? So as I said, when we were reading on writing philosophy, one of the things we said is often it's good to summarize the position you want to critique, which does two things. It brings anybody unfamiliar with the discussion up to speed, but it also lets somebody know how you understand what you are writing on. Do you fully understand it? So we have Hume putting into the mouth of Cleanthes he would be more like a deist. Someone who says, well, I don't want my faith to rest on something like belief in miracles, but instead I want my faith to rest on reason and rationally developed positions. And so Cleanthes places a lot of stock in something like the design argument. So here we have him summarizing the design argument. So remember, this is not Hume's own position. This is the view that he is going to criticize. Okay? And by the way, the name Cleanthes, you might say, well, I've never known anybody named Cleanthes. It's a made-up name. And in it are the root words for hoanthropos, the word for man or human beings in the Greek. Anthropology is the study of human culture, right? That's the anth part. Or thees is the word for theism or God. So his name is suggestive of the fact that even though he wants his faith to depend on rational arguments, he wants to defend a view of God that gives God human qualities like intelligence, like mercy, like love, you know, and so he's got an anthropological view of God, hence the name Cleanthes. So he gives a summary of the the design argument, and we will. If you first read this, you might say, "Well, that doesn't sound like anything Paley or Thomas Aquinas was doing," but that's not the case. He said the world is like a big machine. This is like the picture of a clockwork universe. You know, that the whole world is like this giant mechanism subdivided into an infinite number of smaller machines. Not just like the planets in the solar system, but on this Earth, you know, the parts of plants and animals. And all machines and their parts are admirably adjusted to one another. So, in other words, here we're talking about the fact that the parts of these little machines, like ears and eyes, work together to fulfill a purpose. And throughout nature, means, that is, the parts of these of things like ears and eyes, are adapted to ends, the ability to enable us to see and hear, in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design, like Paley's watch, right? So here we get the idea of ends or purposes, you know. And so this is basically, even though it doesn't seem like it, the same kind of position that Aquinas and Paley were arguing for. Now, just about everyone sees this as an argument from analogy. I do. I read something recently posted on the internet by somebody who's trying to argue that it's not. Well, you know, he's going against 200 years of scholarly tradition by trying to argue that way. And when you do that, the burden of proof is on you, since you're the odd man out, so to speak, the odd person out. The person who's taking a position most other people do, the burden of proof is on you to defend your claim that it's not an analogy. Virtually everybody, including Hume, saw the argument from design as an argument from analogy. So the idea is that the effects, the products of design, resemble each other, and by analogy then, and so here's Paley and his watch. In other words, the products of design in the world, like eyes and ears, resemble the products of human design, like a watch. And so the causes must be similar if the effects are similar, right? And the effects are that they're mechanisms with parts that work together to serve a purpose. So by analogy then, the designers must resemble each other. The author of nature, God, has a mind then like a human mind, right? So rationality and intelligence is given to God. God is not some impersonal force in the background. And since the products of divine design in the world for, defenders of the design argument are infinitely more complicated than the simple products of human design like watches. We can conclude that the divine mind is, far exceeds our mind in its capacity and intelligence. God has larger faculties since the products of divine design are grander than the products of human design. So the conclusion, to sum things up, of the design argument is that God exists, and at the very least we can say God has an intelligence similar to human intelligence, that God is rational to the point of having the capacity to design things in the world to fulfill particular purposes. And I was looking, I got a text from NBC, because I have their app on my phone, that the Coast Guard has announced, unfortunately, that this tanker, not tanker, but cargo ship has probably been lost at sea. That's probably sunk in the storm. And that kind of hits me, because for most of his life, I may have said my dad was a carpenter, but he was a carpenter on a ship. You may not think of a metal ship as having a carpenter, but there are lots of things on the ship that need a carpenter. And this is what he did for years, And so since my own dad was a merchant seaman, it sort of hits home, to see that a merchant ship sank in the eye of that hurricane. And you say, well, okay, that's off the track. Aren't we discussing the design argument? But, from the standpoint of, say, New Testament Christianity, and New Testament Christians are not the only people who would utilize the design argument. Certainly people like Orthodox Jewish people would, I think, as well. But it's a contention that people are designed with different abilities. In my backgammon club, I have a woman who's an accountant. I could never be an accountant, that just works against me. To get back to my dad, one of the reasons why my dad left Pittsburgh, which was where all my mom's people were from, is I think he felt pressured to go work in a factory there. You know what? We'd have probably done better economically if he did, and I'd have grown up with a lot of aunts, uncles, and cousins close to me if he'd have stayed in the Pittsburgh area. But that wasn't him, He wanted to go back, to sea. So, he needed a port city, and while they lived in New York for a while, I could have grown up with a New York accent if they'd have stayed there. But they moved to Baltimore. And so, but it's a contention of at least Orthodox Christianity that God designs people with different abilities. That not everybody has the same kinds of abilities. And that's why I say it's no shame if philosophy is not your thing. History was not my thing. I told you, art is not my thing. The only way I got through art in the 5th grade was that the art teacher would give you a passing grade if you at least gave the illusion that you were trying. And so I got through 5th grade art by at least looking like I was trying to do something. This connects up with the idea of design. Well, let's get back to this. So again, this is not Hume, even though it's from Hume's book. This is Hume placing into the mouth of Cleanthes, one of the characters the argument that he now wants to go on and critique. Okay. Now, first of all, Damia chimes in here, and he doesn't like a probabilistic argument, what we call an a posteriori or argument, one from experience. And the design argument is that. We already mentioned that. That depends on observed similarities between God and man. What he likes is a mathematically necessary argument, an a priori argument like the ontological argument. Okay. But Hume chimes in here and he says, well, you know what? Or this is the more developed David Hume. Hume criticized all probabilistic reasoning when he was very young, with an argument that really was a bad argument. And somewhere along the line, it must have been pointed out. And so the more mature David Hume realizes that there are some arguments from analogy and some probabilistic arguments that are worthwhile and good, even for a skeptical philosopher. So he says, look, my problem isn't that the design argument is a probable argument, a probabilistic argument. What we mean by that is, in what's called a deductive argument, and we don't have time to give you a mini logic course, but the all a priori arguments are deductive. It would be a contradiction to assume that the premises are true and deny the conclusion in a valid deductive argument, an argument that works. You'd run yourself into contradiction. So if the premises, the reasons given in support of the conclusion are true in a deductive argument, it necessarily guarantees that the conclusion must be true also. And the ontological argument is that type of argument. Arguments in mathematics, like arguments in plane geometry, are also that type of deductive argument. But a probabilistic argument still leaves it open that its premises can be true and its conclusion false. I once saw 100% probability of rain not come through when I was living in Charlottesville. They thought Hurricane Hugo was going to come right up the Route 29, Route 95 corridor, hit Charlottesville, then Washington and Baltimore, and a weather system caught it in the Gulf of Mexico and threw it into the mountains. So the hurricane went by on the other side of the Appalachians from where we were in Charlottesville, so we didn't get any rain at all. So 100% chance of rain didn't come through. In a probabilistic argument, even a good one, it's still possible that the premises can be true and the conclusion false. But it's not that way for a deductive argument. So at any rate, Hume says, my quibble with the design argument is not that it's just probable, but that it's not a good probabilistic argument. Now, you need to judge this one for yourself. He projects that the design argument isn't as strong as other probable arguments, that a stone will fall. I was at a friend's house because I don't have cable right now, and they had Prospectors, a show where people were prospecting for gems, and there was this big rock above where they were trying to dig, and they were afraid throughout the show that somehow that rock was going to lodge itself loose. Well, why were they afraid? Because they know if a rock lodges itself loose and it's above you on a hill, it's going to fall down on you if you're under it, right? We know that a stone's going to fall if we drop it. We know that fire's going to burn us. We have to teach young children that. But once they learn it, they know it, that the earth is solid. In other words, you don't doubt, when you strike a dry match that it's going to light, because you've seen that happen thousands of times. Well, he says, our confidence that the next instance of this is going to work is based on the fact that we've seen this happen many times before. But he says, and also the similarity of the cases. One of the things that can weaken an argument from analogy is if the two things you're comparing are not really relevantly similar. And this is what Hume is going to try to argue. But on the one thing, he says we don't have repeated examples of universes to compare our universe to. We don't have other universes to say, well, look, here's a lot of other universes and they were created, so our universe must have been created as well. He says we only got one example, right? I mean, there's that old joke about a final exam, where question 1 is describe the universe, and the question goes on, give 2 examples. Well, now that's you'd be hard put to finish that test in 2 hours, But Hume's trying to say we don't have any other examples, so it isn't an argument based on enumeration of similar cases, what is called an enumerative inductive argument. So he says the design argument isn't like these. We have only one example of design to go from our present world or universe, and the argument may be only a weak analogy because in the end it's not comparing similar things. So where is it getting to? Now, Hume tries to bring his readers up to speed on how an argument from analogy can be good or bad, right? So he says, if we depart from the similarity of the cases we're comparing in an argument from analogy, then this diminishes the evidence that argument gives us for the conclusion. In other words, if the things we're comparing in the design argument are not really similar, then the evidence that argument gives for the conclusion that the world was designed by God is weak evidence. At least this is what Hume is trying to argue. So he says, consider the circulation of the blood. He says we have a very strong argument to conclude that blood circulates in other humans from observing the circulation of blood in a human being, right? And he says, well, even though it's just a probabilistic assumption, still we're comparing relatively similar cases if we conclude things about human blood circulation from the observation of it in frogs and fishes. But by the way, I mean, these analogies can break down. That's why when they're bringing a new drug to market, the first thing they might do is try the drug out on some animal like a laboratory rat or something.
But even though rats are similar in some ways to us, they're also dissimilar, right? I mean, you all are told that you shouldn't be giving your dog chocolate because chocolate can be poisonous to a dog, whereas to us it just poisons us over the course of 70 or 80 years. Not immediately, right? And so, you know, no matter how effective a drug might be from lab rats or rabbits or something, they always say, well, look, before you get final approval, you got to have real clinical trials on real living human beings, you know, before we're going to okay your drug. It's not enough that it works. But Hume says we still can conclude some things about, say, blood circulation in human beings from what it does in frogs and fishes. But he says, suppose we're comparing two very dissimilar things. If any of you ever cut a weed, like you're cutting big weeds in a, you know, you look at the stalk of a corn stalk or a weed, and you've got a lot of tubules in there where sap goes through, and that's what you got in trees, right? Pretty soon, right, we've got, see, I was awake in biology this day, right? We got chlorophyll, xanthophyll, and carotene in those leaves. Carotene is what gives them their orange color. Xanthophyll, their yellow color. The chlorophyll, along with the sap, goes down into the roots for the winter, right? Leaving the xanthophyll and carotene to turn the leaves orange and yellow. The chlorophyll to turn them green. But that happens twice a year, this movement. So just from the fact that you've got tubules, it doesn't mean that sap circulates in things like trees and weeds in our field in the way it does in the human body. In other words, if you're comparing two very dissimilar things, even though they might have some little similarity, like the fact that you know, there are tubes which called blood vessels in us and tubules in the stalk of a plant, it's not enough to enable us to conclude that you have circulation of sap in plants. And so Hume says we would be misled by that analogy to a false conclusion. And this is what he's saying. He's saying, look, my old house, the records, only go back to 1900 because a lot of the records from older houses like mine and a lot of the houses you see around here were lost in the Great Baltimore Fire. When was it? 1905 or something like that. Anyway, they were lost. Nobody knows exactly how old my house is. It's at least back to 1900. But the point is, but I have no doubt, I never, you know, I certainly wasn't around to see it built, but I have no doubt that my house had a designer and builder, just like the new apartment house that's going up across the street from me. Why? Because I'm comparing similar cases. On seeing a house, we conclude with the greatest certainty that it had a builder, right? Because all the houses we've observed in the past have had designers and builders, so this one must have had one too, right? But now what if we, but he says, is the universe like a house where it was put together and designed all at once? You know, the presumption of a similar cause, he says, is only a guess, a conjecture, a presumption. So he says, is it a good analogy to compare the universe with a design product, like later on Paley's watch, or for Hume, a house? He says, just because we see order, that by itself does not prove that that order is there as a result of design. Philo and Cleanthes agree that the following is only a proof of design if shown by experience to proceed from an order or the arrangement or the adjusted. Final causes for Aristotle were the ends to which something was designed, right? So the purpose that it's designed for. So a priori, the above could be caused by something internal to matter itself. Now remember, Hume is writing probably 60 or 70 years before Darwin publishes in the 1840s. Hume's writing in the 1770s, right? Paley writes in 1802, after Hume. And Hume is a philosopher, not a scientist, but he knows a lot about the science of his day at a certain level. And he says, well, what if matter itself might produce its own order, as well as the mind can do? The elements may fall into some exquisite arrangement by some unknown internal material cause. He says this is as easy to conceive a possibility as that the divine mind is the source of such order and arrangement. And of course, this is the claim of Darwinism as well, that Paley says, well, look, the eye is similar to a manufactured product like a watch. The watch needed a designer, hence the eye might have needed a designer, and who would have designed the eye other than the author of nature, God himself? Whereas Hume is saying, well, what if there were forces within nature that tended toward order? And this is the argument of Darwin with natural selection, that in the case of something like, say, a human eye, we didn't have it designed and built, you know, like Genesis 1, right? Hume's not going to accept Genesis 1, you know, where Adam and Eve are created and zapped into existence. He's saying, I mean, Darwin would say, well, the process of natural selection and survival of the fittest means that those mutations with that have adapted to their environment better, you know, with the positive features, they are more likely to survive in the struggle for existence and replace, ultimately, the others. And so over the course of millions of years, you get more and more complex forms of life with more and more complex eyes, ending eventually in something like us, right? I mean, this is the story of evolution, that there, and Darwin saw evolution as a non-directed, completely random naturalistic process. In other words, that there was no divine intervention, that it was just forces in nature and blind chance. A 20th century evolutionist who was portrayed by one of the characters in Jurassic Park, said, look, if we ran this whole random process over again, there's no guarantee that it would result in us. We weren't the end goal of the evolutionary process. That we're here, I mean, traditional evolution says, is a happy accident, you know. But if we ran the whole thing, see, in backgammon club meets tonight, I really need that tug. I mean, I don't have enough time as it is. We use precision dice because they give you a random roll that's close to what the laws of probability say you should get. But if you shake the dice up, and you've got a random process and you throw them out, maybe you get a 6 and a 1. This time, if you run that random process over again, the odds are against you getting a 6 and a 1. It'll be something else. Maybe it'll be 2 6s. Maybe it'll be a 2 and a 3. And so the original Darwinian concept then of evolution is that it's an entirely random process. However, as your author, points out, there are ways of reconciling evolution. It's called theistic evolution, with God as creator, by saying, well, we don't deny that the Earth is millions of years old, and that there are things like adaptation and natural selection, but they're part of the design and the divine plan as to how we're going to come along. But that there was direction, unlike that it's not a totally random process as Darwin imagined. So Hume's a non-scientist, so he speculates about other causal principles that they would have known in Hume's day, right? Heat or cold, attraction and repulsion of magnetism. He says nature has many causal principles like that, and design is only one principle that might produce something. Some things in nature affect others by design, but he says it's illegitimate to reason that all do. It wrongly goes from the part to the whole, that some things might be the product of design, therefore everything in nature is, he says, is a wrong argument. Like drawing conclusions about the generation of a human being from that of a single hair. Now, Cleanthes gives something very close to I haven't managed my time too well, but that's okay. We'll pick up the rest of this. Very close to what we just saw in Paley, that the eye has a structure that implies a contriver. This is a good place to stop. We'll pick up the end of Hume's critique, because it's worth looking into, and then we'll see what I've got done. I'm not going to guarantee that we'll go over the test Wednesday, but we probably will. It's a probabilistic argument that we will. Okay, we'll see you Wednesday.